Welcome, everyone. I guess it's that time, and hopefully be joined by some people like me who are looking for parking, which is always a problem in Portland these days. Welcome to everybody, and especially to our distinguished guests to the John and Francis Ford Film Festival. I'm Kevin Sturr. I teach at Boston University. I work in film. I had the privilege of working with Michael Connelly on a book called John Ford in Focus. Well, we made a great deal of references, to say the least, to the work of the experts. And we're really lucky this weekend. We've done many different Ford tributes, but this weekend we have two of the greatest experts on John Ford, Joseph McBride, whom I'll introduce in a second, as well as Dan Ford, who's here, both biographers of John Ford. And we also have, I think, the world's expert on Francis Ford, Professor Kathy Fuller-Steele, who cared with well will be speaking this weekend. And thanks to all of you who were with us last evening for a really nice event, which included the screening of Wagon Master, as well as a Francis Ford silent film. I would say, I'll just repeat just a little bit of what I mentioned last night. At the beginning of the chapter on John Ford's boyhood in Portland and Joseph McBride's epic biography, definitive biography, I would say, of John Ford, Searching for John Ford, John Ford is quoted as saying, "I love Portland, I don't even know if they like me." And we Portland, as Maine, were long overdue in recognizing John Ford's status as what I regard as America's greatest filmmaker, as well as a six-time Oscar winner, as well as probably the world's greatest filmmaker if you look at his influences on great directors like Kurosawa and Fellini and Bergman and so forth. So, a hometown boy, but we've been slow lately to recognize the amazing work of his brother Francis, his older brother Francis, who brought him to Hollywood. So we're going to hear a lot more about that as well. We're very lucky to have these three experts with us this weekend and to hear from them, starting last evening, but especially for the symposium. And I would like to introduce Professor Joseph McBride, Distinguished Professor of Film Studies in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. I could not begin to even list Joe's publications, not only in film studies, I would say, but also including his wonderful memoir and his work on the JFK assassination, for instance, and recently on politics and social media. But he has written seminal works, obviously, on John Ford, including the biography I've mentioned, Howard Hawks, Orson Welles, and he knew all these people well and talked to them in detail, and had worked with Orson Welles, his friend, on his unfinished movie, which was recently finished, and you can catch it on Netflix, The Other Side of the Wind. And Professor McBride had worked for 6 years, I think, on that with him, including acting in the film. He's recently written wonderful critical studies, which I really enjoyed, on Billy Wilder, great director, on Hans Lubitsch, pioneering filmmaker. He recently wrote a wonderfully succinct book that captured the essence, I think, of the Coen brothers, and really was able to deal with their films in such a fascinating way to capture their complicated vision. Most importantly, in December, Professor McBride will release a revised, expanded version of his first seminal work on John Ford called John Ford, co-written with the late Michael Wilmington. And that will be out in December, so we hope to read that and then talk more about that soon. But Professor McBride has taken the time to be here with us in John Ford and Francis Ford's hometown. And he's chosen both for last evening as well as for today works which we feel are underappreciated in the Ford canon, both Wagon Master as well as Seven Women. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Professor McBride about this. I think without further ado, I could talk all day about his accomplishments, but welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everybody for coming. It's so great to be here. I've been here before and I love Portland. What a beautiful city. I'd love to live here. but it's great to be in the hometown of Francis and Jack. And I've quoted the German poet Goethe in some of my biographies. He said, "To understand a poet, you must go onto the poet's land." So here we are on the poet's land. John Ford is the great poet of American history, the American West. He's the closest we have to a national poet, like I guess Walt Whitman is right up there too. But Ford has also been called America's Shakespeare, which is very apt. And Richard Nixon, I wrote to him asking for an interview because he said Ford was his hero in every sense of the word, he told me. And he said, "I'm too busy writing a book on world peace, but I'll write up my thoughts on Ford." And like a week later, he sent me from his office at 7 World Trade Center, a 535-word essay on John Ford. It was wonderful. It was the classic Nixonian rant about Vietnam. It had some very good insights into Ford. He called Ford America's Tolstoy, which I think is a very apt comparison. Tolstoy was a very conflicted man like John Ford, and very complex, and that's why he created all the variety of characters he did in a book like War and Peace. And John Ford has this vast gallery of characters in his work. And he's conflicted, and he didn't resolve all his conflicts, but that's characteristic of great artists. There are contradictions and things to puzzle over, and he kept us thinking. And 7 Women is a really great film, so I hope you stay and see that. It was terribly neglected in its time, but it's one of my favorites. But I want to thank Gene Haney for inviting us and for organizing this wonderful event. And it was just, I was in awe of her organizational skills and all the things that go into a conference that you have no idea. It's amazing. And to Michael Connolly and Kevin Sturr, great historians, and I love their book, John Ford in Focus, because it goes beyond the research I was able to do and digs deeper into the connections in Portland and Cape Elizabeth, which is really fascinating. Also the Irish connections in Ireland, which I covered as best I could too, but they really take it beyond, which is wonderful. And Kathy Fuller-Seeley, I got the pleasure of meeting yesterday. She is researching whiz, and I think her book on Francis Ford and Grace Cunard, whatever form it takes, is going to be a very important book. I was just thrilled when I heard that she's doing this because Francis is so neglected, and he's such an important figure, as I mentioned yesterday. John Ford said he learned everything from Francis, and he's forgotten partly because a lot of his films are lost, but Kathy, like a true scholar, is digging into, like there's a woman who did a feature, a documentary on Alice Guy Blaché, who was the world's first woman director. And part of her job was to find films by Alice Guy Blaché, and she spent 10 years finding films. And Kathy's doing the same with Francis, studying all the documents. There's a tremendous amount of documentation and paper trail on all of this, as I find out in my research. You just have to be diligent, dig it up, and that's what she's done. And Dan Ford, it's always great to see my old friend Dan Ford. I've been an ace Ford biographer, really laid the framework for the rest of us because he interviewed all kinds of people who were no longer with us and did a lot of primary research with his grandfather and other people. So he's done wonderful work. So let me tell you, my keynote address, I chose the title, The Morals of Decorum, John Ford, Poet and Comedian. And Orson Welles described John Ford as a poet, a comedian, unquote. Rather than simply go over old ground or offer safe bromides about Ford, I want to tackle a topic that goes to what I see as Ford's essence and is also unsettled critically, a provocative subject rather than something everyone already has a set opinion about. Ford's comedy is often controversial with his detractors and even among some of his admirers. Some argue that his broad comic strokes and jarring shifts from drama to comedy mar his work. But I've always maintained that Ford's sense of humor is one of his strongest and most characteristic attributes. Being both a poet and a comedian is essential to Ford's tragicomic and very Irish view of the world, and to the anarchic, subversive streak that coexists with his lifelong reverence for tradition. Ford was an enigmatic personality. He refused to discuss his work seriously on most occasions, wouldn't explain it, and kept aspects of his personality a mystery. Perhaps if Ford were so inclined to explain why he always acted like such a secret man, to borrow the title of one of his silent westerns, he might have admitted, like James Joyce, quote, "I put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries, arguing over what it meant, and that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality," unquote. Very Irish, puckish sense of humor. Although Ford sometimes obliquely let out his thoughts to interviewers, most of the time he was virtually impossible to interview, as my own 1970 interview with Ford amply demonstrates. You can hear it online. It's kind of embarrassing because it was my first interview in Hollywood. I was only 23, and I was trying to interview the most interview-proof guy in the history of movies. But I put it up there because it's an interesting document. Ford said some, he stonewalled me a lot, but he also said some really interesting, thoughtful things. It was kind of like Spielberg's meeting with Ford that he portrays in The Fabelmans, although I had an hour with Ford. Ford would claim he didn't remember his own films or actors if he didn't understand their meanings. He was like that with his co-workers too. His leading lady, Vera Miles, described him to Peter Bogdanovich as the most perverse man she ever met. As Ford told the columnist Hedda Hopper in 1962, "I don't want this to get out. I pose as an illiterate." So we have to turn to his films for what he thought and felt. His work was where his true emotions reside, not in his conversation. Ford wanted his work to speak for itself. So the task of a Ford biographer and/or critic is to ferret out the man from his films, not from what he said about them, which was often a lie, a joke, or a devious smokescreen. Ford's habitual obfuscation was self-protective. The secretiveness was part of his defense mechanism as a Hollywood filmmaker, as well as of his Irish heritage, a legacy of hundreds of years of repression. The way he slyly chose to express himself through his emotional scenes is key to understanding his work. And yet, though Ford's comedy is so integral to his view of the world, even many critics who otherwise admire him feel it necessary to apologize for the comedy. His love of low comedy, roughhouse antics, drinking and brawling is often viewed as coarse, a flaw in his work, incongruous with the beautiful visual compositions and the nobility of much of his characterizations. His concentration on grand and often tragic themes seems to some critics to sit oddly with his fondness for low comedy. Ford was a great artist who generally presented himself as a humble craftsman, calling directing just a job of work. This was one of Ford's survival mechanisms in a long Hollywood career that began in the silent days. It reflected his cautious need to fly under the radar artistically while not declaring himself an artist. If you did that in Hollywood, you'd eventually be out of work, as was the case with Stroheim, Sternberg, Renoir, and Wells. Ford made his share of bad or mediocre films throughout his career, but that was the price he paid to remain bankable and make his intermittent masterpieces. Ford presented himself as more consciously artistic in the 1930s with The Informer and other films. He began winning Oscars and quietly coveted the prestige. His failure to attend the Oscars to receive any of his four awards in person was part of his pose of indifference. I love what he said, why he didn't show up to get his Oscar for The Grapes of Wrath. He said, "I was taken drunk." But he kept retreating to Westerns in a time when they were generally regarded as potboilers, with an occasional exception such as Stagecoach, as another defense mechanism making Westerns, and because he preferred to be outside the mainstream where he could work through subterfuge. He preferred to express himself through Westerns in the post-war world because it was safer when dealing with controversial subject matter at the time of the Red Scare. And so he dealt with such themes as racism, genocide, military folly, class prejudice, and governmental corruption in Westerns since no one cared or noticed. But his primary defense mechanism was always what screenwriter Alexander Jacobs called this sort of Irish defense, as it were. You could never get a sane word out of him because he was, quote, a mad Irishman. The absolutely marvelous decision he made about Hollywood, it allowed him to work in complete harmony and peace within his chosen world. The producer, David O. Selznick, admitted, none of us can figure out what is in John Ford's mind. In a statement to Bogdanovich that would confound the critics who disparaged his comedy, Ford complained, I feel I'm essentially a comedy director, but they won't give me a comedy to do. Ford was always something of a comedic director. His early silent westerns often had raucous comedy elements, such as in Bucking Broadway, Hellbent, By Indian Post, etc. Ford's 20s films tried various genres while he was still searching for his artistic personality. His films of the early sound era showed new signs of going for prestige with heavy drama and sometimes were lacking in comedy. But the comedies he made with Will Rogers in that period helped bring out and develop Ford's mature style. It was in full evidence when he made his 1939 Americana trilogy, Stagecoach, Young Mr. Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk. And by the time he left for World War II in 1941, he was an absolute master of his medium. If How Green Was My Valley had been his last film, it would have been a fitting one, with its rich interplay of comedy and tragedy expressing all sides of life and death. And indeed, it seems to have been designed as a possible valedictory, complete with an ending in the afterlife. Along the way, Ford made some fine outright comedies. To name some of the early ones, Riley the Cop, Up the River, Judge Priest, The Whole Town's Talking, and Steamboat Round the Bend. But when Ford fails artistically, his sense of comedy is usually the first casualty. Ford admitted to Bogdanovich that The Informer lacks humor, which is my forte. Other serious films suffer from that lack as well. When Ford was giving Thomas Mitchell a hard time on the set of Stagecoach, Mitchell said, "That's all right, I saw Mary of Scotland." Ford's best films usually blend comedy and drama. The Searchers, The Sunshine's Bright, No Green Was My Valley, Young Mr. Lincoln, Wagon Master, to name just a few. And even the essentially tragic Grapes of Wrath, They Were Expendable, The Man Who Shot Liberty Balance, and Seven Women have many moments of humor. And I'll mention that some people think Seven Women is unintentionally humorous, and they mock it. Short-sighted people mocked it when it came up, but actually it's a dark comedy in some ways. Ford designed it that way. They just didn't get it. I asked Ford, were you bothered when the American critics didn't like Seven Women? He said, it was over their heads, which was true. As the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw observed, life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it ceases to be serious when people laugh. One of my favorite examples of that tendency from Ford's work is in his 1946 Western, My Darling Clementine. The saloon girl, Chihuahua, Linda Darnell, is shot. Her lover, the drunken doctor, Doc Holliday, Victor Mature, has to sober up and operate on her in a saloon, but he fails to save her life. It's a dark and tragic scene. But Ford turns his focus comedically to Marshall Wyatt Earp, Henry Fonda, admiring the stoical expertise of the nurse Clementine, played by Kathy Downs. That daring turn from tragedy to comedy ends with my favorite line of all of Ford, delivered by the wonderful old character actor J. Farrell McDonald, who appeared in 25 Ford movies and even starred in one of his silent films, Riley the Cop. McDonald in Clementine is Mac, a saloon keeper like Ford's own father. After Earp and Doc share celebratory drinks at the bar, Doc leaves, grimly telling Clementine she was a brave girl. But watching from the bar, contemplating the nurse, Earp asks, Mac, you ever been in love? Mac replies, no, I've been a bartender all my life. I suggest that some of the objections to Ford's comedy stem partly from an uneasiness with his Irishness, and for some critics are a smokescreen for their disdain for the side of his personality that unapologetically celebrates his ethnic roots. Some more assimilated Irish Americans of later generations than Ford's feel embarrassed by his ethnic humor or feel the need to apologize for it. You can sense in some of those observers an embarrassment over the raucousness of an artist whose family was so close to the boat what they call one parish over from Ireland. In addition to criticizing Ford's penchant for low comedy, such critics have cataloged other alleged weaknesses in his work, such as his uninhibited expression of sentiment viewed negatively as sentimentality, his relaxed, often dilatory pacing, and his fondness for interrupting plots with atmospheric interludes. All these are seen as indulgences, like his tendency to mix comedy and drama. Furthermore, Ford's comedy is unsettling because his anarchic, subversive streak coexists uneasily with the virtues he most revered. I had a conversation in the 1970s with J.A. Place, who was called Janie Place, who wrote 2 books on Ford, and she told me she thought Ford was an essentially feminine director. Since he was typically regarded as primarily a director of men, I expressed surprise at that counterintuitive notion. She explained that the values Ford held most dear, family, community, tradition, and the land, were historically regarded as feminine. How right she was. And it is no coincidence that those are also quintessential American values: family, community, tradition, and the land. The central paradox of Ford's work is that he was an idealist who anxiously dwells on the destruction of his ideals. The breakup of families, the loss of land and community, the withering away of tradition. Appreciating his subversive sense of humor and his mockery of his own ideals and of himself is critical to understanding Ford. This volatile combination of factors is what makes his body of work so rich and complex. And it was his Irishness that gave Ford his sense of the interrelationship of comedy and drama. Ford's tragicomic view of the world is a reflection of his cultural heritage. The Irish view of life is both tragic and ridiculous. For an Irishman, a view of history that's both solemn and derisive makes perfect sense. And in some ways, Ford's sense of humor serves as a defense mechanism against life itself. You can also see this tendency in the work of James Joyce, Sean O'Casey, Shaw, and Oscar Wilde, who observed life is far too important a thing ever to talk seriously about. And in the work of such Irish-American writers as Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner, and Edwin O'Connor, whose serio-comic political novel, The Last Hurrah, Ford filmed. Ford has affinities with Charles Dickens, another great popular artist with a serio-comic style. Bertrand Tavernier once said the best book on Ford is G.K. Chesterton's book on Dickens. Read that book, it's good. And like so many other Catholic artists, Chesterton, Graham Greene, Joyce, Louis Buñuel, Alfred Hitchcock, Ford often expresses himself through paradox, which Chesterton defined as truth standing on her head to get attention. Ford valorized tradition in his work. He often identified with the establishment and wanted to be part of it, as people from immigrant families often do. He identified with the military, sought military honors, became a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy, and liked to parade around in his uniform and display his medals. His daughter Barbara sarcastically described him as a ribbon freak. But Ford's subversive anarchic side coexisted and counterbalanced his military glory-seeking and hero worship. Ford's military films generally take the side of the ordinary soldier or sailor. They display an ambivalence toward following orders and a disdain for authoritarianism. His friend and film editor, Robert Parrish, called him a cop hater by religion. Anti-Irish bigotry and class bias are evident in some of the writings about Ford. I confess I've never shared the general fondness for the celebrated American critic James Agee, largely because of what he wrote about Ford's cavalry western Fort Apache when he reviewed it for The Nation in 1948. Agee complained that, quote, "there is enough Irish comedy to make me wish Cromwell had done a more thorough job." So I see I don't have to explain that to this audience. Agee's insensitive joke in quotes can't simply be excused as American ignorance of history and genocide, coming as it did only 3 years after the world saw the evidence of the Nazi Holocaust. So he had to have been conscious on some level of how offensive it was and just didn't care. I saw that quote used approvingly in an academic article on Ford published in the US only a few years ago. So that attitude persists to some degree. Anti-Irish prejudice is still acceptable in certain cultural circles. Scott Iwan's 1999 biography of Ford accuses his 1957 Irish film, The Rising of the Moon, of what he calls, quote, Celtic obnoxiousness, unquote. And every time Ford's Irishness is mentioned, it is immediately linked in knee-jerk fashion with superciliously disapproving references to the most common stereotypes of the Irish, drinking or fighting. The social prejudices Ford had to live with much of his life helped give his work its vitality, as well as what the French critic Philippe Hodequet called his obsession with justice. Contrary to Ford's romantic claims of childhood poverty in Maine, he said, "We were so poor we had to eat lobster 3 times a day." He grew up in a relatively comfortable environment, but he was always conscious of the struggles and slights that Irish Americans had to endure in WASP-dominated New England. The feeling of being an outsider fueled Ford's deep desire to belong, to be part of the establishment, to be part of American tradition. That led him to identify with the West, and his flight from his New England roots reflected his dual sense of belonging and not belonging in mainstream America. The great Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges wrote, "New England invented the West." And it is, as the Irish writer Fintan O'Toole puts it in his book, The Lie of the Land, Irish Identities, for Britain, the Irish are the Indians to the far west, circling the wagons of imperial civilization. Once in America, of course, the Irish cease to be the Indians and become the cowboys. Ford put it this way: who better than an Irishman could understand the Indians while still being stirred by the tales of the U.S. cavalry? We were on both sides of the epic. Underlying everything in Ford are the typically Irish traits that make his work so moving and entertaining: his willingness to express powerful emotions without embarrassment, and his tragicomic view of existence. These are the best and purest expressions of his Irishness. The dark and tragic side of Irish life and politics is never absent from Ford films, even from his most successful comedy, the joyous and beloved romance, The Quiet Man. Fordian comedy stems partly from the Irish streak of anarchism that Barry Fitzgerald's Micheline O'Flynn embodies by vowing to, quote, talk a little treason. I also think of the old Irishman in Ford's 1927 comedy drama, Mother McBride, who has to be restrained from throwing rocks and passing members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, and says he wants laughter at his wake. If fighting is a sign of disruption and misrule in Ford's work, the friendly brawls and comical braggadocio that permeate his work are also Ford's way of showing people embracing. There's no point in pretending that Ford didn't love scenes of drinking and brawling. Fort Apache has a number of such scenes, as do his other cavalry films. But the question is, how does he use them? It can't be denied that some of his comedy is very strident and overdone. The brawling and other comic shtick can get protracted and tedious, such as the fight scene at the wedding in The Searchers, or the hideous screeching of William Tracy throughout Tobacco Road, or Wart Bond and Gene Tierney crawling through the dirt to express lust. Some of Ford's comedy is intentionally disturbing, but some is disturbing and insensitive in ways he didn't intend, such as the sequence with Martin Pauly, Jeffrey Hunter, in The Searchers, brutalizing his Irish wife, who's called Look, despite being part Cherokee himself. But generally, I believe that those who condemn Ford's comedy are missing a key aspect of his work. And though Ford's use of comedy in counterpoint to tragedy is often faulted by short-sighted critics, this filmmaker shares that trait with William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's tragedies often have strong comic elements, and the closest connection with Ford is that Shakespeare's history plays mix low comedy with the drama of noble characters. The low characters parody and mock the more exalted characters. The most glorious example is the way Falstaff comments on and interacts with Prince Hal in the tavern scenes that echo and parody the scenes in the royal court. See Chimes of Midnight by Ford, admirer Orson Welles. The Shakespearean virtuosity with which Ford interweaves the serious and ridiculous aspects of life helps give his film such vitality and truth. Why is it that what is acceptable in Shakespeare's history plays, the jarring alternation between high drama and low comedy, is not acceptable to many people in Ford? Is it because Ford is closer to being our contemporary, and that because of the photographic realism of filmmaking, he seems more naturalistic than Shakespeare, whose work seems entirely stylized today, partly because of its archaic language, but also partly because of its distance in time? The deliberately jarring shifts between high drama and low comedy are seen throughout Ford's work, and perhaps are especially evident in his cavalry films, which are full of Irish characters who mock the pomposity of the WASP officers and undercut their authority in the process. The film critic Shigehiko Hasumi said he suspected that there's something traumatic in Ford's films. I don't know what it is, but it's there. Jonathan Rosenbaum responded, I suspect it has something to do with leaving home. I think this is true, although perhaps not exactly the way these two critics suggest. I believe the evidence indicates that the trauma underlying Ford's life and work stemmed from his sense of his family being uprooted from their Irish roots, from his parents having had to leave their Irish home because of the Great Famine, and from Ford's resulting sense of being part of the Irish diaspora, torn between two cultures, creating conflicts that provided him with fertile artistic material. The moving but painful nostalgia in his films, the recreation of an ideal world that has always been destroyed, is a reflection of that primal trauma he replicates obsessively in his films, showing families and communities being torn apart. There is a great poignancy in that view of life, but there is also rollicking and sometimes dark humor. In a rare moment of expansiveness, Ford defined his method to the French critic Joe Mcbride in 1955, shortly before making The Searchers. Ford said what he sought in stories was the tragic moment, the crisis of an individual conscience, which is also by extension the turning point of the society it represents. He said, it enables me to make individuals aware of each other by bringing them face to face with something bigger than themselves. The situation, the tragic moment, forces men to reveal themselves and to become aware of what they truly are. The device allows me to find the exceptional in the commonplace. I also like to discover humor in the midst of tragedy, for tragedy is never wholly tragic. Sometimes tragedy is ridiculous. Ford went on to tell Mcbride, I should like to do a tragedy, the most serious in the world, that turned into the ridiculous. That is a perfect description of The Searchers, a tragedy the most serious in the world that turned into the ridiculous. The film is about a romantic nightly quest that turns into absurdity, with the alleged hero, John Wayne's Ethan Edwards, setting out to rescue his kidnapped niece, but then trying to kill her because of his racist hatred and miscegenation. The party Native American Martin keeps trying to stop Ethan from killing her, and the Shakespearean fool, Old Mose Harper, played by Hank Worden, keeps finding her, but Ethan keeps losing her. The fool and Martin do the heroic deeds, finding Debbie and killing her captor, Chief Scar, Henry Brandon. The quest takes 5 years and ranges all over the West, up into Canada and down into Mexico, but mostly never seems to leave the relatively small area of Monument Valley on the Navajo Reservation. And Debbie is found very close to where she was captured. Ford uses all this ridiculousness to undercut the myth of the romantic Western hero, since Ethan is so deeply flawed by violence and racism. Like the Roadrunner and his nemesis Wile E. Coyote, who also inhabit Monument Valley in their cartoons, Ethan and Scar pursue each other endlessly and in circles, made bitter and fierce by how, as D.H. Lawrence wrote of America, quote, the very landscape in its very beauty seems a bit devilish and grinning, opposed to us. The ultimate absurdity is that Mose finally locates Debbie again right down the road from where she was kidnapped. The quest is circular and absurd. Ethan might as well have stayed home all those years and waited in old Mose's rocking chair for her to come back. But in fact, when Ethan finally does bring her home in his arms and deposits her on the front porch, you can't help feeling a thrill, because it's such a tremendous accomplishment, and he's become something of a heroic figure despite himself. As James Joyce writes in Ulysses, think you're escaping and run into yourself. Longest way round is the shortest way home. The powerful drama of Ford's 1948 cavalry film, Fort Apache, which is the film that made me fall in love with John Ford when I saw it on TV in 1967, is about a vainglorious martinet leading his men into a massacre. And it's intermingled with Shakespearean comedy involving the mostly Irish troopers from whose ethnic group the cavalry in those days was largely drawn, since immigrants then as now have to take the dirty jobs to prove themselves true Americans. In Fort Apache, Ford has the Irish characters and their more humane values mock the fatal stiffness of the snobbish, anti-Irish, highly class-conscious WASP Lieutenant Colonel Thursday, Henry Fonda, who can't keep his men's names straight. He thinks all Irish people are alike. It's the Irishness that survives as Ford shows the dead cavalrymen living on in a memory image, an expression of the very Irish and very Fordian sense that the dead are always with us in our memories. Beth Morgan insists on how green was my valley, that her sons who are gone remain, quote, in the house, unquote. In both films, Ford focuses largely on the women in the community as the mainstays of stability and tradition. Ford always believed in showing and celebrating people's ethnicities, reveling in Irish humor, playing with ethnic stereotypes while undercutting or showing the humanity underlying them. He was ahead of his time in taking pride in his ethnicity. In that era, and I remember this from my own childhood, and you probably do too, the American ideal was the melting pot. We were taught that we were supposed to submerge our ethnic identities and melt them away to become homogenized Americans. Ford would have none of that. He was not only proudly Irish, but also foregrounded other people's ethnic views and celebrated them and their differences from the mainstream culture. An outgrowth of Ford's ethnic pride was his career-long concern for minorities, which goes hand in hand with his obsession with justice. Unlike many other directors of his time, such as the ultra-waspish Howard Hawks, who has virtually no African Americans in his work, or the Italian immigrant Frank Capra, who mostly relegated blacks to humiliating, subservient roles, Ford has minority group members throughout his work and puts them in important roles. Not just Irish and Native Americans, but also African Americans, German Americans, Jews. Ford grew up with these people in these ethnic groups in his multicultural neighborhood at Munjoy Hill. Ford, I found out in my research, was the Shabbos Goy for a while, lighting stoves for Orthodox Jews on the Sabbath. Although sometimes characters of various ethnicities are portrayed problematically in his work. These problems are built into American life. One of the tragic elements of Fort Apache and other Ford cavalry films is that as Irishmen and other minority group members have to prove their right to be Americans by fighting and killing another minority group, the original Americans. Ford's ethnic characters are usually treated positively and with affection, though it must be admitted that his ethnic humor sometimes does become merely stereotypical and occasionally insensitive. But with Ford overall, I would argue that the ethnic humor is a sign of warmth and fellow feeling, ethnic solidarity within groups and among minority groups, and that Ford, and indeed even his characters themselves, as Barry Fitzgerald does in The Quiet Man, self-consciously play riffs on the stereotyping and make fun of those images, while acknowledging the role of stereotypes and how minorities are viewed socially. Sly role-playing becomes second nature to an oppressed people, as Ford seemed to be saying when he remarked in 1964, "The Irish and the colored people are the most natural actors in the world." That suggests he sees these ethnic groups in terms of the use of stereotypical behavior to mock and outwit the oppressor, as his Irish characters do toward the British throughout his three-part 1957 Irish film, The Rising Moon. Act the dumbing, says one Irish guard to another as they prepare to outwit the British by helping an IRA man escape from prison. The comedy in Ford's work stems from his awareness of the clash between ideals and reality, the interplay between the high and low aspects of life, the noble and the absurd. This conflict is the essence of his most successful comedy, The Quiet Man, and it is a dimension missed by the film's detractors. The comedy and drama both arise from the same roots and manifest itself in cultural misunderstandings, mostly on the part of John Wayne's Sean Thornton in his romantic idealization and misperception of Ireland. Sean is Ford's surrogate, leaving America to return to the imagined Eden that Ford's parents had left behind in Connemara. The film embodies as well as critiques the conflict between his and Ford's dream image of Ireland as another word for heaven to me, and its more mundane reality. Sean is doubly in exile from Ireland and from America, and the film exemplifies Anthony Burgess's comment about James Joyce, that exile was the artist stepping back to see more clearly and so draw more accurately. It was the only means of objectifying an obsessive subject matter. Ford's sense of tragedy as ridiculous often stems from the sometimes bitter comedy of cultural clashes. In Seven Women, his last feature set in 1935 China, there is a scene of an Irish Protestant missionary, Eddie Albert, preaching to a classroom of uncomprehending Chinese children. This was the scene that provided the key that unlocked the door to Ford's personality for me and made me begin to understand him. It came to me in a flash, seeing an extreme close-up of a Chinese boy struggling to understand a sermon thoughtlessly delivered in a language he doesn't know. Then I fully understood Ford's dark sense of humor and how it is intermingled with tragedy. What Ford meant by saying sometimes tragedy is ridiculous is nowhere better displayed than in his 1949 cavalry western She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. There are two successive retirement scenes, one for John Wayne's Captain Nathan Brittle's serious and sentimental, and one raucously comic, the second for Victor McLaughlin's Top Sergeant Quincannon, a parody of the first but with a serious undertone to the comedy. Brittles receives a silver watch from his men and gives an emotional speech about how he won't be going out with them again. Ford adds a bit of humor by having Brittles embarrassedly having to use his little wire-frame glasses to study the inscription on the watch. The captain then orders his longtime aide, Quincannon, to try out civilian garb and go to the sutler's store to have a few drinks in celebration of his own impending retirement. You probably remember the scene. The captain, Brittles' scheme is to get Quincannon drunk and thrown into the guardhouse so he will survive his final days of duty and won't have to go out on a risky mission with the rest of the troopers. As Brittles expects, Quincannon starts one of Ford's most elaborately balletic Irish drunken Donnybrooks while simultaneously toasting his comrades. He finally is marched off to the guardhouse by the wife of their commanding officer. Looking at retirement as both tragic and ridiculous, Ford engages the subject with this Irish duality of perspective, and in exactly the same way Shakespeare alternates his high and low tragedy and comedy. In Fort Apache, McLaughlin's similarly comic Irish character Sergeant Mulcahy winds up getting killed with the others in the massacre. Shortly before that, he makes a magnificent malaprop that conveys a deeper truth about Ford's comic characters. Ford especially loved to give such Shakespearean malaprops to his favorite, quote, Irish, unquote, comedian. McLaughlin actually was an Englishman who pretended to be Irish on screen. When Ford Sergeant Major O'Rourke, setting the stage for the non-commissioned officers' dance, warns Mulcahy and his routing pals to be on their best behavior tonight and set a good example for the men, Mulcahy assures him, "Oh, don't worry, Michael, me darling, will be the morals of decorum." He pulls out a bottle of liquor and says, "Now where's the punch?" In that backhanded way, Mulcahy expresses the true function of the comic relief in Ford's films. I put comic relief in quotes. They provide the moral grounding for his view of life as a tragic comedy. And as so often happens in Ford's films, Mulcahy's noble death in an absurd cause sets his comic antics in relief and helps humanize the film's historical sense of tragic loss. Yet even such a usually eloquent champion of Ford as Andrew Sarris uncomprehendingly complains about the, quote, boisterous Irishness of Fort Apache, particularly the boozy, brutish braggadocio of Victor McLaughlin's Sergeant Mulcahy. It may seem odd to quote Karl Marx to explain the work of John Ford, but he became in effect the first Ford critic when he wrote in 1852, Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. Ford's conflicts helped make him a great artist, even though they also made him a tormented man. In this, he resembles Tolstoy, as none other than former American President Richard Nixon, a great admirer of Ford and a rather tormented man himself, pointed out to me, John Ford was to motion pictures what Tolstoy was to literature. Tolstoy, like Ford, was deeply conflicted, an aristocrat who wanted to be a peasant, a libertine who wanted to be a saint, which is one reason he could create so many kinds of characters and why his sympathies were so hopelessly divided, which helps lead to great art. But even if Ford's life resembled a Russian novel, since Ford was Irish, let's end by giving the last word on this subject to fellow Irishman William Butler Yeats. Quote, we make of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry, unquote. And I would add, conflict with both others and with ourselves also produces comedy. Hence, John Ford, both poet and comedian. Thank you so much. Thank you, John Ford. Thank you. Anyway, we have a program we want to move on to. I guess we're exactly on time. I think what we're going to do is we're going to show before we show 7 Women, which, by the way, is very hard to get because it's never been released on DVD or Blu-ray in America. There was a beautiful Laserdisc that MGM put up, but it's out of print. But I got a DVD from Spain where you can buy it, maybe you still can, it has an English soundtrack. But we have a pretty good copy. It may not be as perfect, it's really a gorgeously photographed film. Joseph Lachelle photographed it, who was a great cinematographer, won the Oscar for Laura, and he photographed Billy Wilder films like The Apartment and Kiss Me Stupid, and he was the camera operator for Arthur Miller and Ford's films such as How Green Was My Valley. And it's a really stunningly beautiful film, great acting. Flora Robeson, who's in the film, said the blocking was like ballet. If you're into how directors move actors around, which is a really key part of being a director, it is breathtakingly beautiful. Ford wrote a letter after it, and he said he thought this was his best film, and he disdained the critics who dumped on it. I'll just say a couple things about 7 Women. It's really an apocalyptic film. It's a very dark, despairing film.